And hello everyone, it is Peter Sam, the Narrow Gauge Engine here, and it is time for the season everyone's been waiting for me to get to, what many consider to be the best Brenner season, Season 20, which, like Season 10 before, it has 28 episodes. But do I think it's as good as everyone else does? That's the question I shall be answering today, folks. However, as always, we shall be starting with the worst episode, that being number 28, 3 Steam Engines Gruff. I cannot put into words how bad this episode is. I can't tell if it's because it's in Season 20 or if it's really this bad, but I think it's the worst episode in the Brenner era so far. The characterizations of Toby and Percy make for such unlikable protagonists, and it's not like Thomas is full to the brim of personality, as I much prefer that to him being a constant, inconsiderate arsehole. I think the worst part of this episode, though, is its climax. Toby and Percy start rushing across the bridge and then stop. Like, what are you waiting for? Go! It's not like you're the least bit bothered about Thomas. You abandoned him to be the third Billy Goat brother and left him to do all of the hard work. If they had both broken down, I would have been more forgiving, but that's not how the episode panned out. Another problem with this episode is just how much time the story focuses on the broken fence scene at the beginning. It's the quite obvious twist that's shoved in your face because Thomas won't shut the fuck up about it. A nice subtle hint or two was all that was needed. I think the most upsetting part about this episode, though, was the fact that it was written by Andrew Brenner, the symbol of Thomas's new age, wrote an episode as bad as this and thought, oh, you know what, it's worthy, belonging in the same season that has Henry Gets the Express, Love Me Tender, and the Arlesdale episodes. I have genuinely never been more upset, more pissed off at an episode before. What the fuck is this doing here? Anyway, I'd better move on before I turn into a certain someone. Number 27, Over the Hill. Over the Hill is not much better. Not only does Stephen feel incredibly out of character, but there is no climax to this episode despite it having a race. I get it was done for comedic purposes, but I never laughed at any of it. It also feels incredibly haphazard that the Earl just decides to make a railway museum. What's he going to put in there? Other sentient engines? Is he not going to let these locomotives move, or what? It just feels like an incredibly stupid idea. Anyway, the only good part of the episode is the Eye of the Tiger reference shoved in halfway through. The supposed resolution is rushed and is just Glyn and Stephen mocking Gordon and James, which I would be all for if they had a valid reason or any actual funny lines, but nope. If I don't sound as passionate about this one, it's because 3 Steam Engines Gruff just sucked the life out of me, but rest assured I am still pissed at this episode for existing too. Number 26, Pouty James. This is an episode that is very rich in morals, which sucks because the moral doesn't feel like it at all fits with the Thomas episode, or maybe it's just the way it's written. Yeah, it's probably that actually. When Sir Topham Hatt calls James a young steam engine, it just feels wrong and very weird. His sort of fatherly role to these steam engines is enhanced to an uncomfortable degree, as is James's narcissism, to make this episode work alongside the moral and create one weird episode. I do like the idea of Sir Topham being a father figure to his engines, but I don't think making him act like their actual dad is the best way to go. Also, there's some horrifyingly weird faces pulled by Thomas, Emily, Henry, Gordon, and Porter. I feel like most people know why this one sucks, and if you like this one, then have fun with shit like this. Number 25. What's this? Another tie? What a shocker. Buckle Tracks and Bumpy Trucks and the Christmas Coffeepot are both just pretty bad, really, aren't they? Buckle Tracks and Bumpy Trucks is not only a horrible title for an episode, but the episode itself is too focused on Sir Topham Hatt and barely gives any time to the characters who actually feel like the leads in this one, Belle and Flynn. Now look, I like these guys as much as the next person, but you can't sell them short really, that's just an injustice to them. The Sir Topham Hatt scenes are funny, I'll admit, but really all it does is just create this life lesson that white reflects heat and black absorbs it. A life lesson that nobody will use because there's this little thing called fashion and an even worse thing called sweat, which white clothes do not hide, unfortunately. I don't even want to call it a moral because it's not. Morals provide societal and legal compasses for children, this does not. So yeah, Buckle Tracks and Bumpy Trucks sucks. Now let's talk about the Christmas Coffeepot and how only the good parts are the Marion parts and everything else is just bad. Not in the sense that the writing's poor, but in the sense that the plot is just hero of the rails again. Thomas and Percy are scared that Sir Topham Hatt will scrap an old engine they find and try to find a way to help him. And considering that film came out before this episode, this feels like such a regression in character. Also, something I should mention is that both episodes are paced incredibly slowly, and so it makes both of them a lot more boring as a result. I guess the Christmas Coffeepot is better, but only by a little bit. So yeah, that's the order until like an hour later when I change my mind. Number 23, The Way She Does It. This episode is a perfectly meh one in my opinion. The story is a bit too boring for me, and it has a nice ending with Daisy being able to laugh at herself. I think the strongest thing about this episode is Daisy's character. Her personality is very strong throughout all of her episodes, but I think it's the most noticeable in this one because there's really nothing else about it. It exists, it's fine, let's move on. Number 22, Diesel and the Ducklings. I'm not a big fan of this one, I've got to be honest. It's got a nice ending and it's sweet that we get to see Diesel, Ari and Bert's soft sides with these ducklings, but I don't know if teaching kids that blackmail is sometimes okay sits right with me. Like, I get that Diesel's mean and he probably does deserve it at least a little bit, but Thomas doesn't exactly befall bad fortune because of how he treated him. Besides that, this episode is not the most amazing anyway, it's just one of those more boring ones with a plot that's really uninteresting and rather dull. Number 21, Mucking About. Oh my god, no way! A new Jack and the Pack Central episode for the first time in at least 10 years. I wonder what it'll be about. Oh, it's just some boring ass story about Max and Monty. Yippee, what joy. The story's fine, it's not the worst thing in the world, but out of all of the characters from the pack to make a story about, you choose those two, possibly the most boring and one-note members of the pack. Speaking of the characters, the pack is now made up of only Jack, Alfie, Max, Monty, and Oliver for some reason. There's no Kelly or Byron or any of those cool characters, just 3 diggers and 2 trucks. Boring. This whole pack returning thing always felt like a lazy attempt at fan service, and this episode should have been one of those cancelled ones that was written all of those years ago, like Jack's Snow Rescue, not this rather boring and menial plot. Number 20, Saving Time. Another rather fine plot which is just fine. I don't mind Samson as a character, and I know a lot of people see him as one of the weakest characters from the Brenner era, and I'd probably have to agree, but I think he's still a decent enough character. It's not like I hate him or anything. Or this episode, as a matter of fact. It has its moments, and the ending is quite amusing, but I think the other Samson-related episode this season is just better. I don't know what to talk about besides that, I guess we'll just move on. Number 19, Henry in the Dark. Everyone tell Rob the Green Engine I'm sorry, quickly, before he casts me out. Whilst dumb, this episode can be funny. I feel like it's trying to be one of those episodes where you have to go into it taking nothing seriously, but it fails for me because it's not nearly as funny when compared to something like The Beast of Sodor, which is iconic because of its intertextuality and comedy. Here, everyone thinks Henry is a ghost train because he glows? I don't follow the logic. He's the same engine, the same colour even, and yet just because he's luminescent nobody can recognise him. That is honestly so dumb, and the humour doesn't make up for it. The plot of having Henry scare all of the engines because they ignored him is decent, but besides from that it's fairly weak for me because of that one criticism. This whole plot is held up by this fairly weak idea that somehow an engine glowing makes them unrecognisable, which is why it's number 19 on my list. Number 18, Bradford the Brake Van. Bradford is an amusing character, following railway regulations down to a T. Think of Fergus as a brake van, but less swaggy and more firm. That's Bradford. He is the obvious main focus of the episode, and his character is the best part as the episode displays the advantages and disadvantages of having someone like that around. Apart from that, this episode's boring as hell, what can I say? It's cool that Whiff gets a role. Yeah, the ending's kinda nice, but it feels rather forced, and it seems to me like they're trying too hard. All in all, I would have liked to have seen more of Bradford, and I feel like having him in an episode with Toby or Diesel would make such interesting dynamics, but oh well, I guess we'll never know. Number 17, Tit For Tat. Okay, alright, I know. How dare I put an adaptation this low, but to be frank, pun intended, I've always found this story the least interesting out of the 3 Arsdale ones, and it's not as if the other 2 are absolute masterpieces, even in story form. If you want to see my opinions of the stories themselves, I'll be making a video on all of the Railway series stories, hopefully for August, but it may be later, so stick around. Sorry, shameless plug over. Not only is the story quite vanilla in comparison to most of the other episodes, but just look at the clergymen, they are freaky, they look like uncles to the trolls. Didn't quite make it out of the uncanny valley on that one. Apart from that, again, this one's fine. It's a story I'll watch, but it's not like I'm in love with it. Number 16, Sidney Sings. Sidney is a fun character, and this episode is decently fun, but I think more could have been done with the idea of his forgetfulness. It feels like this small little fun plot could have been a lot bigger and a lot more dramatic, and yet this episode was just Sidney trying to remember things, and it just ends up with him not doing that. That's such a wasted opportunity. Maybe we could have had an episode where Sidney's forgetfulness ends up helping someone or saving someone from danger, but we didn't get that, and that upsets me. The episode itself is fine though, and perfectly enjoyable. Like with so many of the other episodes this low down, however, it pales in comparison to the many gems this season has to offer. Number 15, Engine of the Future. Hugo is a nice enough character, although this episode isn't void of any problems. The beginning of this episode is way too long, and the ending is so rushed, like what the hell? I felt quite robbed when I watched it, to be honest, and I expected more with Percy's goal to try and convince everyone that Hugo isn't trying to take over. I like the subversion of that tropey plot as well. Immediately when asked about it, Hugo explains how he cannot take over from the engines, which differs from something like Harvey to the rescue, which is just the basic norm. Anyway, with a bit of an extension to the ending and a reduction of the intro, this episode could have been a lot better. Number 14, Letters to Santa. Halfway done now. Letters to Santa is great at showing the dynamic between Percy and Harold, and that is the main focus. I know this is going to sound shocking, but I don't mind Harold here. It's not like I like him, but I don't hate him this time round. He seems a lot less up himself, and I can appreciate that. However, I think the episode is a bit boring at times, and I feel like more tension and suspense could have been brought to the table, whether that's through the music or the events of the episode. It just felt a bit too plain for something that could have been really powerful. Also, side note, the map that's shown at the start of the episode is really cool. Number 13, Toby's new friend. I love a good character dynamic, and Toby's new friend has that on lockdown. I enjoy Philip's constant attempts to try and be friends with Toby, and how their contrasting character makes for such great scenes, such as Philip trying to take on more water. Bro is for real that desperate. The moral clearly makes this episode, and it's about learning to accept your differences and still be friends, as well as experiencing new things, as shown by Philip trying to enjoy the peace and quiet near the end. I think it's overall just very sweet, and I believe it's a great direction to throw Philip's character into. Number 12, Useful Railway. I think Useful Railway is a great ending to the Little Arlesdale episode trilogy, although seeing it on screen isn't as good as on paper. I know a lot of people don't like the slow-mo thing they do with the crash in this one, but honestly it manages to add some flavour to an otherwise rather vanilla episode. Audrey's stories aren't always interesting when compared to the ones Brenner and his team writes. That may be hard to hear, but I find it to be true, especially in a season with such good stories like this one. There's some great character interaction, and I enjoy seeing these engines work as a team, especially because of that ending, but for the first half it is pretty basic. Sorry all of you out there that put this trilogy in your top 5. Number 11, Mike's Whistle. This is clearly the best episode of the three. The story's fun, the character interaction between the Arsdale engines and Duck 2 is at its peak. Not only that, but there is a fun and creative solution to Mike's lack of a whistle. It's no faulty whistles, which is far better, as it's with a cast of characters who are far more interesting. Remember whose channel you're watching before you disagree. Plus, an organ is more interesting than voices. You know who else pretended to whistle and act like a steam engine with his voice? Stafford. And you know how many times he spoke this season? Once. Twice at a push. You have that piece of dumb logic thrown at you. Anyway, Mike's Whistle is fun, and it would have been higher up if Thomas hadn't been there laughing at Duck, creating this idea for the kids that laughing at Duck is okay, even if they are reinforcing the message that insulting people for their weaknesses is wrong. Honestly, Thomas, for once, could you not have been in an episode? Number 10, Ryan and Daisy. This episode is a great one for developing both Daisy and Ryan's characters. Now, if you know me, you'll know I love episodes where two characters take something from one another, and whilst this episode isn't great at doing that, it's still an earnest attempt, and both characters develop enough within the episode for me to forgive it. Daisy realises sometimes she has to do work that she doesn't like, and Ryan learns not to be so much of a pushover. It's great character development for the both of them, and that is the main best part of the episode, and is what most of it focuses on. To be honest, apart from that, this episode doesn't do a whole lot, but at least what it does do is really good, and it also expands upon the lore of the show, plonking Daisy in the coastal run. Number 9, All in Vain. Another really great episode that does bounds and leaps for James's character. He gets his paint incredibly dirty and goes through his own perception of hell for his special. As well as this, some of the interactions between Edward and James are so sweet. And their dynamic is quite nice to see again, considering Edward never really gets episodes anymore. However, despite all of that great stuff, there's a few little problems I have with the episode. The bigger of these two is the fact that James flips out over one tiny scratch despite having just been covered in literal shit. I get it's like a metaphor or a deep-rooted message or whatever, but just having watched James get over all of that other shit, it feels like a major overreaction. It feels like that anyway, but especially after all of that. Also, there's that dumb moment in the Steamworks with the painter bloke giving the thumbs up. It's so awful and it ruins that scene, which is such a shame because there's an actual funny moment in there with Sir Topham. Despite all of that though, this episode is still a great one for the other aforementioned reasons. Number 8, Skiff and the Mermaid. Skiff and the Mermaid is possibly the dumbest episode I have ever come across, and that is exactly why I love it. The stuff with Skiff and the Mermaid, you know, the title of the episode and what it's supposed to revolve around, is fine in all honesty. It's nothing too offensive, but nothing too interesting either, but what makes this episode is the dramatics of Sir Topham. He's so fucking extra, and I love it. The Castaway reference, despite him still being stuck on Sodor, is just the best because it makes fuck all sense. He would have seen if Skiff was heading in that direction. It's all just good fun, and can make me laugh every time I watch it. Number 7, Hugo and the Airship. This is the other Hugo episode this season, and he is so sympathetic in this one, believing that he belongs in the air instead of on the rails, and having to learn that his differences is what makes him unique and fun and just generally a cool character. The little gimmick at the start of the episode with the engines thinking Hugo can fly is fun too, as well as Hugo accidentally blowing Skiff backwards. There really aren't any negatives I have on this episode, the other episodes just beat it because I find them more enjoyable. Number 6, Henry Gets the Express. Now I know for a lot of people this one is their favourite, and I can see why. This one feels very akin to the classic series with its plot, writing and style. Gordon is mean to Henry and gets his comeuppance when Henry gets the Express due to his own lack of care. This is so nice to see, as Henry is a character who's had his fair share of problems, none in his control, so the Henry fans would obviously quite like this one. I also find watching Gordon unhappy very fun, especially in this era, so that's another win. In general, it's just quite a fun one, and is a great look at the character dynamics of the two big engines of the series. But this just couldn't get it to the top 5. Let's see what episodes did end up there now. Number 5, The Missing Breakdown Train. Now I sense that this episode choice being in the top 5 may upset a few people, but I find The Missing Breakdown Train incredibly fun to watch. Judy and Jerome are great characters to see interact with the world around them, and having them just talk about the different places they wind up in is quite entertaining in my opinion. They should start a podcast. I do think more could have been done with the concept, like having Judy and Jerome visit Ulfstead Castle, the Blue Mountain Quarry, the Animal Park. But as the episode stands, I still really like it and the resolution works well as well. Although I'm not sure if having one of your two breakdown trains all the way up in Harwick is the best idea considering it's so far removed from the main line, but it fits the arc that's been undergone nicely, so I'll let it slide. The thing to take away from this one is that I want more Judy and Jerome centered episodes. Number 4, Blown Away. Blown Away is an episode that has a lot to appreciate and love about it. The characters, the visuals, the ending, those are all great and I could talk about those, but it's not what I want to address with this episode. What I want to address is the music. Man, did Ed Welch go hard with this. It really enhances the danger of the situation Skiff, Duck and Oliver get into during the episode. And whilst I'm no music expert that can analyse every note and what it does, I can say it really pushes the danger of this one. There is one little moment in there that's a bit dumb, and that's how Skiff tries wriggling from under the tree. It looks a bit stupid to me, but I can get past that because of all the other good things that make the episode up. Between this and Skiff and the Mermaid, I've really started to like Skiff. Hopefully he gets more episodes in the next season. Number 3, The Railcar and the Coaches. This episode is another quite good one, and that is largely because of the character dynamics and the consequences they befall throughout the course of the episode. These characters are Daisy and Thomas's coaches, Annie and Clarabelle. Let's talk about Daisy first. Daisy teases Annie and Clarabelle, and then they get their own back, when tricking Daisy about hearing noises supposedly coming from her. This leads her to freak out and rush off to find her fitter, leaving everyone stranded at the platform because of her own vanity and making her look like a fool. Great. Then, because Annie and Clarabelle tease Daisy, they're left out in the snow and then are scolded by the fat controller, and then they are pulled around by Diesel the following day. I love that insult to injury at the end, and really this is how Diesel and the Ducklings should have been. Not to rant about that one again, but Thomas straight up blackmailed Diesel and wasn't punished for it. He may have had good intentions, but that could apply to Annie and Clarabelle in this episode too. What a great episode with just such fun characters interacting together. Number 2, Love Me Tender. Love Me Tender is such a good showcase of the relationship between Donald and Douglas. They argue and they disagree on the best course of action to take, sure, but when the chips are down and Donald realises he's just left his brother stuck in the snow, he stops at nothing to look for him. It also creates a funny gimmick in the process of Donald pulling around Douglas's tender. Something easy for kids to be able to recreate with their own take and play or Trackmaster sets or whatever merch line they own. I can appreciate that about this episode. The one thing I'd say I'm not a fan of is exactly where Douglas ends up getting stuck. This random siding is boring and there's no real risk involved in getting there. Maybe if Donald and Douglas had parted ways and Douglas had ended up going up a branch line and crashing, maybe Donald would have more interesting locations to traverse, like tunnels and bridges as opposed to just the main line, but it's so clear that these two care about each other, and I think doing a story with these two characters was a perfect move, because no other twin characters would be able to pull this story off the right way. A true masterpiece of the season, but just barely misses out on the number 1 spot. Number 1, Cautious Connor. Wow, another Connor episode got in first. This is like the 3rd time he's been in an episode from a season that was put in number 1. I just really like his character, in all honesty. He's a lover of fun, and whilst he can be gullible, he does care a lot and has heart. He feels like that ultimate hero character, someone fast, brave, and is rather laid back despite that. But what this episode does with him is nothing short of great. Connor essentially becomes a shell of what he once was when he has one problem once. He's scared that this fault will come back again and again, because he's never really had this happen to him before, and takes things slow, denying his want to be fast, because as he says, it's better to be safe than sorry. That's how much this guy cares. He'll put his speed and his own desires second because he fears if he does that he'll put his passengers in danger. So it takes a pep talk from Steven, which by the way is the most amazing scene ever, to convince him to go fast again. That scene is hilarious and is the pinnacle of that older, chaotic neutral character type. Then Connor decides to go fast again, and the episode is finished. The end. I feel like explaining this episode would be the only way anyone would see why I put this in first. So tell me, have I made you see the light now? Can you see why Cautious Connor is my favourite season 20 episode? Let me know down below. I really like season 20 and can understand why for many it's the best Brenner era season. Despite its lows, namely those 2 extra episodes with Glynn, there are some great highs in there, and it really feels like lots of characters were given their own episodes here. Everyone got their time in the spotlight, except for maybe 1 or 2 characters, and for the most part the episodes were quite enjoyable. It will of course never match the peak of the classic era, but for what it's worth, that's what I consider this season to be, the peak of the Brenner era. But all of that may change with the next season we'll be looking at, season 21. But my opinions on those episodes will have to wait until that video. Until then, I've been Peter Sam, you've been you, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.